The scent of lemon polish and expensive leather filled the air, a familiar perfume of wealth she had grown accustomed to. From the 45th floor penthouse of Vinhome's metropolis, the city of Hanoi glittered below like a carpet of scattered diamonds. Amelia, 7 months pregnant, and feeling the gentle weight of her future in her belly, smiled. Her husband, Julian, was a king, and this was their castle. But tonight, with their regular cleaner sick, she decided to do something small, something normal, for the man who gave her everything. She would clean his home office herself, a tiny act of love. She pushed open the heavy mahogany door, armed with a dust cloth and a bottle of spray, completely unaware that she wasn't walking into an office, but into the graveyard of her own heart. The voices she would overhear from his forgotten, still-active speakerphone would not just be a crack in her perfect world. They would be a sledgehammer, shattering it into a million irreparable pieces. Life, for Amelia, had become a waking dream. 2 years ago, she was a freelance graphic designer, sharing a cramped apartment with 2 roommates, her days fueled by instant noodles and lukewarm coffee. Her talent was immense, but her bank account was perpetually anemic. Then Julian happened. He'd walked into the small gallery where her digital art was being featured, his presence sucking the air out of the room. He wasn't just handsome. He was sculpted with a jawline that seemed carved from granite, and eyes the color of aged whiskey that saw right through her defenses. He was Julian Croft, the CEO of Viridian Dynamics, a tech behemoth that was single-handedly reshaping the future of renewable energy in Southeast Asia. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been told no. He bought her featured piece on the spot, not through an assistant, but by speaking to her directly. He hadn't just been interested in the art, he was interested in the artist. Their courtship was a whirlwind, a blur of Michelin-starred restaurants, private jet trips to Phuket, and front-row seats at Paris Fashion Week. He listened to her dreams, admired her mind, and made her feel like the most cherished woman on the planet. He'd scoffed when she tried to pay for a coffee. "Amelia," he'd said, his voice a low, comforting rumble, "let me take care of you. All I want is for you to be happy. Focus on your art, on us." And so she had. She'd given up her freelance grind, not because he demanded it, but because his world was so intoxicatingly full that there was scarcely room for anything else. He'd commissioned a state-of-the-art studio for her in their sprawling penthouse apartment overlooking West Lake. It had every tablet, every monitor, every piece of software she could ever desire. Yet she rarely used it. Her greatest creation, she felt, was the life they were building together. Now that life was about to include a child, a son. Julian had been ecstatic when she told him. He'd held her, his strong arms a fortress around her, and rested his forehead against hers. An heir, he'd whispered a word that sounded slightly feudal and dramatic, but she'd chalked it up to his overwhelming joy. A son to carry on the Croft name. His protectiveness had tripled since the pregnancy began. He'd hired staff for everything, a chef who specialized in prenatal nutrition, a driver for even the shortest trips, and a team of cleaners who kept the penthouse in a state of museum-like perfection. Amelia at times felt less like a wife and more like a precious, fragile doll being kept pristine in a glass box. She missed the simple things, the satisfaction of cooking a meal, even if it was just spaghetti bolognese, the feeling of her own hands making her own space clean. It was a connection to the woman she used to be. The woman she sometimes felt was fading away, which is why tonight she found herself standing before his home office. Maria, the head of their cleaning staff, had called in with a fever. Julian was at a late-night fundraising gala, an event his doctor had advised Amelia to skip in her third trimester. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the air purifier and the distant murmur of city traffic. Restless and filled with a surge of nesting energy, Amelia had an idea. She would clean his office. It would be a surprise for him when he got home, a little touch of her in the most sacred of his spaces. She gathered the supplies from the utility closet, eco-friendly sprays, and soft microfiber cloths. The office door was as always imposing. It was crafted from a single slab of dark mahogany, soundproof and severe. Julian's office was the one place in the penthouse that was entirely his. It was his command center, the brain of his empire. She'd only been inside a handful of times, always at his invitation. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The room was breathtaking. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window offering a panoramic view of Hanoi's dazzling nocturnal skyline. The desk was a vast minimalist expanse of polished chrome and dark wood dominated by 3 glowing monitors currently displaying scrolling stock tickers. A faint scent of his cologne, oud, and bergamot lingered in the air. It was the scent of power, the scent of her husband. She smiled, feeling a rush of affection. She set to work first, dusting the shelves filled with leather-bound classics and awards for innovation. She polished the glass casings of his scale models of futuristic wind turbines. She moved with a quiet efficiency, the gentle, repetitive motions soothing her restless spirit. The baby gave a soft kick, as if in approval. "There, little one," she whispered, patting her stomach. "We're taking care of Daddy." Her final task was the desk. It was surprisingly tidy, save for a few stray documents and a high-tech conference speakerphone, a sleek black disc in the center. She picked it up to wipe underneath it, and her finger brushed against the main button. It glowed faintly. Odd. She assumed it was off. Thinking nothing of it, she placed it back down and began wiping the surface around it. It was as she was leaning over to polish a chrome leg of the desk that she heard it. A crackle from the speakerphone, followed by a voice. A woman's voice, crisp and sharp as shattered ice. "So the transfer is complete." Amelia froze her hand, hovering in mid-air. She straightened up slowly, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. It was a conference call. He must have forgotten to disconnect it. She should leave. It was a private business call. It was wrong to listen. But then she heard Julian's voice, and it rooted her to the spot. "Yes, Isabella. The funds are in the escrow account. Phase 1 is complete." His voice was tired, but it held the same calm authority it always did. Amelia's brow furrowed. She knew he was closing a major deal, a merger with a rival corporation from Singapore. He'd been stressed about it for weeks. Maybe this was the final step. The woman Isabella spoke again. Her voice was devoid of warmth, pure business. "Good. And the other asset, is it still on track?" Amelia felt a prickle of confusion. Asset. Were they talking about a patent, a piece of technology? Julian sighed. It was a sound Amelia knew well. It was his end of a long day sigh. "Everything is proceeding as planned. The doctor says another 8 to 10 weeks. Healthy. A boy." The cleaning cloth fell from Amelia's hand and landed silently on the plush rug. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into her veins. What was he talking about? Why was he discussing their baby, her pregnancy, on a business call? Isabella laughed, a short, humorless bark. "Excellent. Your little rustic artist is proving to be a surprisingly efficient incubator. I have to admit, Julian, I had my doubts about your choice. She's so painfully simple, but she served her purpose. Rustic artist, incubator, served her purpose. The words didn't compute. They were alien monstrous. Amelia's world tilted on its axis. Her breath hitched in her throat. She felt a sudden sharp pain in her lower abdomen, a cramp of pure shock. She clutched her belly, leaning against the desk for support. Her vision swam. This had to be a mistake, a grotesque misunderstanding. But then Julian spoke again, and his words were the final, brutal confirmation. They were the nails being hammered into the coffin of her life. She has Isabella, he said, his voice flat, devoid of the love and warmth she cherished. It was the voice of a stranger, a cold-hearted executive, discussing a line item on a balance sheet. She played her part perfectly. She believes every word, every kiss, every promise. She has no idea that our marriage is just another clause in the merger agreement. Isabella's voice purred through the speaker. And after the birth, what's the protocol for her retirement? The contract is clear, Julian stated, his voice as sharp as a blade. She'll be well compensated for her services, of course. A generous settlement, a quiet annulment. She signs the NDA, relinquishes all parental rights to the heir, and disappears. She goes back to whatever quaint life she had before me. And the Croft-Lyon merger is solidified with the heir securing the dynasty for the next generation. It's clean. It's business. Relinquishes all parental rights. The phrase echoed in the silent, opulent room. It ricocheted off the glass walls and stabbed into Amelia's heart. This wasn't a baby born of love. This was a commodity, an asset, a living, breathing deal sealer. And she was just the vessel, a temporary employee hired for a 9-month contract to be paid off and discarded like all the others. Her legs gave way. She slid down the side of the desk, landing in a heap on the floor, the plush carpet, doing nothing to soften the blow to her soul. A strangled sob escaped her lips, a raw animal sound of pure agony. The city lights outside blurred into a meaningless smear of color through her tears. The beautiful penthouse was no longer a castle. It was a cage, a beautifully decorated, gilded cage. And she had just realized she wasn't the queen. She was the prize broodmare, and her baby was the trophy. The man she loved, the life she cherished, the future she was carrying inside her, it was all a lie. A meticulously crafted, soul-destroying lie. And the truth, overheard in the sterile silence of a forgotten phone call, had just broken her completely. For a long moment, Amelia couldn't move. She remained crumpled on the floor, the world reduced to the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, panicked thumping of her heart. The voices from the speakerphone had ceased. The call had ended. But the words lingered, tattooed onto her brain with acid. Incubator, contract, relinquishes all parental rights, disappears. Each word was a physical blow. The cramp in her belly intensified, a knot of terror and betrayal. My baby. She thought, her hands flying to shield her swollen abdomen, a primal protective instinct kicking in. My son. He wasn't an heir. He wasn't a clause in a merger. He was hers. He was a part of her, a tiny, innocent life she had loved fiercely from the moment she saw the second pink line on the test. A wave of nausea washed over her, so violent she thought she might be sick right there on the expensive rug. She crawled, dragging herself away from the desk, from the demonic black disc of the speakerphone, as if it were radioactive. She needed to get out of this room. This room that was supposed to be the heart of her husband's world had become a tomb, the place where her love and naivety were laid to rest. With trembling limbs, she pushed herself up, using a leather armchair for support. She had to be strong. Not for herself. The woman she was 20 minutes ago was already dead, but for the child inside her. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tears were a weakness she couldn't show. She looked around the office, her eyes now seeing everything with a horrifying new clarity. The awards on the shelf weren't symbols of his brilliance. They were trophies of his ruthlessness. The family photos on the credenza, one of them on their wedding day, another of them in Halong Bay, both of them beaming, were props. Stage dressing for the grand play he was directing with her as the unwitting lead actress. Her mind raced, piecing together fragments that had never made sense before. The strange formality of the prenuptial agreement, which his lawyers had insisted, was standard for a man of his stature. The way he always referred to the baby as the heir or the Croft legacy. His relief, which seemed almost financial when the doctor confirmed it was a boy. His insistence on her giving up her career, isolating her from her old life, her old friends. It wasn't protection. It was control. It was ensuring the asset was kept in a secure, controlled environment. A cold, hard fury began to replace the hot agony in her chest. It started as a spark in the pit of her stomach and grew into a glacial resolve. They thought she was painfully simple. They thought she was a rustic artist who could be paid off and sent away. They had underestimated her, and that was going to be their first and most critical mistake. She had to get out of the office before he came home. She forced herself to walk back to the desk. Her hands shook as she picked up the fallen dustcloth. She methodically, robotically finished wiping the desk. She put the cleaning supplies back in their place. She had to erase any sign that she had been there, that she had heard anything. Her survival and her son's depended on her ability to play her part just a little while longer. She closed the office door behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding like a prison gate locking into place. She walked through the opulent living room, every beautiful object now seeming grotesque. The crystal vase, the silk cushions, the abstract painting they'd bought together, it all felt like blood money. She went to their bedroom and looked at herself in the ornate, full-length mirror. A pregnant woman stared back, her face pale, and her eyes wide with a terror she had never known. But behind the terror, there was something else. A flicker of steel, a mother's will to fight. She had to compose herself. Julian would be home soon. He would expect to find his adoring, docile wife waiting for him, and that is exactly what he would find. She splashed cold water on her face, took a series of deep, calming breaths, and put on the mask of perfection. When she heard his key in the door an hour later, she was curled on the sofa, a book open in her lap, a soft smile on her face. The perfect picture of domestic bliss. "I'm home," he called out, his voice echoing in the grand space. "In here," she answered, her own voice sounding surprisingly normal even to her. He walked in, loosening his tie. He looked tired, but triumphant. The gala must have been a success. The merger was complete. He smiled when he saw her. It was the same smile that had once made her heart flutter. Now, it made her stomach churn. "Hey you," he said, walking over and kissing her forehead. His lips felt like ice against her skin. "I thought you'd be asleep." "I wanted to wait up for you," she said, closing her book. "How was it? Long." He sighed, sinking into the armchair opposite her. "But productive. very productive. He looked at her, his gaze softening as it fell to her stomach. And how are my two favorite people doing? How dare you, she screamed in her mind. How dare you pretend, but outwardly she smiled. We're good. He's been a little quiet tonight. I think he's sleeping. He needs his rest. He's got a big life ahead of him, Julian said, a note of deep satisfaction in his voice. It took every ounce of Amelia's self-control not to flinch. Every loving word was now a calculated line of dialogue. Every tender gesture was a deception. He was a phenomenal actor. She had to be better. I was thinking, she said, keeping her tone light and casual. Now that we know it's a boy, maybe we should start seriously thinking about names. He looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in his whiskey-colored eyes. Was it surprise, annoyance that she was deviating from the script? Of course, he said smoothly. We can do that. Any ideas? I was thinking of names from my side of the family. She began testing the waters. Maybe Michael after my grandfather. Julian's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. A strong name, but I was thinking something more traditional, something with history. Alexander, perhaps? Or Spencer? Something befitting the Croft name. Befitting the merger, she corrected silently. He wasn't choosing a name for a son. He was choosing a brand for a product. Of course, Amelia said, forcing a gentle laugh. Whatever you think is best, Julian. She saw the subtle relaxation in his shoulders. She had passed the test. She was still the agreeable, simple girl he thought he'd married. He stood up and stretched. I'm going to take a quick shower. He paused and looked down at her, a look of what she now knew was feigned affection on his face. I love you, Amelia. You. I love you too. She whispered the lie, tasting like ash in her mouth. The moment he disappeared into the master bathroom, her mask crumbled. The smile vanished, replaced by a grimace of pure loathing. She listened to the sound of the shower running, her mind a whirlwind of frantic calculations. She had been a fool, blinded by luxury and a fairy tale. But the fairy tale was over. Now it was a war. And her enemy was the man sleeping in her bed, the man who held all the power, all the money, and believed he held all the cards. He believed she was weak, simple, and disposable. He was about to find out how wrong he was. She wasn't just fighting for her heart anymore. She was a mother now, and she was fighting for her son's life and freedom. She looked over at the dark, silent door to his office. The game board was in there. The contract. The proof. Somehow, she had to get it. She had to find the weapon that would free them both. And she would do it while smiling, while playing the part of the perfect pregnant wife. Her performance had just begun. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Amelia existed in a state of hyper-vigilance, a double agent in her own home. She smiled when Julian kissed her, laughed at his jokes, and discussed nursery colors, all while a storm of cold fury raged within her. Every moment was a performance, every touch a violation. She studied him, not as a wife studies a husband, but as a strategist studies an opponent. She catalogued his routines. The time he left for work, 8:15 a.m., sharp. The time he returned, rarely before 7 p.m. The way he always placed his briefcase on the hall console table. The specific, intricate password he typed into his laptop, his fingers moving in a blur of muscle memory. Her old life, the one she'd been so willing to leave behind, now became her secret weapon. Before Julian, she'd been resourceful. She'd known how to stretch a dollar, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to be observant because her survival depended on it. The soft, pampered life he had built for her had been designed to dull those instincts, but they were still there dormant. waiting to be reawakened. The biggest challenge was the office. It was his fortress. He often worked from home in the evenings, the heavy mahogany door shut, locking her out of his world in more ways than one. She needed to get back in there alone for long enough to search for the contract she now thought of as her son's Declaration of Independence. Her first attempt was clumsy. One evening, as he was heading into the office, she feigned a sudden craving. "Julian, darling," she'd said, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness. "Could you possibly pop out and get me some of that gelato from Pistachio? The baby's just screaming for it." He'd stopped his hand on the office doorknob and given her a look. It wasn't annoyance, it was assessment. A cool, calculating glance she'd never noticed before. "Now, Amelia, it's past 9. Can't we have Chef whip something up?" "It's not the same," she'd pouted, putting a hand on her belly. "He's being very specific tonight." He'd hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "All right," he'd said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "For my boy, anything." He'd taken his keys, but as he walked out, she saw him subtly palm his personal phone from the counter, the one he never usually took on such short errands. He was likely checking the penthouse's internal security cameras from an app. He was monitoring her. The realization sent a chill down her spine. The cage was even smaller and more secure than she'd imagined. By the time he returned, she had done nothing but sit on the sofa, feigning impatience. She had to be smarter. She needed a legitimate reason to have the penthouse to herself without him being able to check in. The opportunity came a week later, disguised as a gesture of his care. "Amelia," he announced over breakfast, "I've booked you a full day at the Serenity Spa at the Metropole. A prenatal package, massage, facial, the works. My mother always said it was important to be pampered during pregnancy. You deserve it." "Get her out of the house," she translated internally. "Keep the incubator happy and docile." "Oh, Julian, that's so thoughtful," she cooed, her heart pounding with a new idea. "But my back has been so stiff. I was wondering, could they possibly do a home visit? I'd feel so much more comfortable here." He considered it. A home visit was still pampering. It still fit the narrative of the caring husband. "I suppose so," he said slowly. "If that's what you want, I'll have my assistant arrange it for this Friday. I have back-to-back board meetings all day, so I'll be out of your hair." It was perfect, a block of time, a legitimate reason for him to be gone, and for the security systems to be less of a concern. Friday. She had 3 days to prepare. Her past as a graphic designer and digital artist had made her tech-savvy. She spent hours online using encrypted browsers on a burner tablet she'd bought with cash, researching high-end home security systems and corporate-grade safes. Men like Julian didn't hide important documents in a filing cabinet. They used something far more secure. Her search led her to the Aegis Pro, a biometric safe, often disguised as a piece of furniture or hidden behind a wall panel. It could be opened with a fingerprint and a multi-digit code. His fingerprint was the problem. The code, she suspected, would be something sentimental. It was the hubris of men like Julian. They compartmentalized their lives so completely that they couldn't imagine their sentimental side being used as a weapon against their business side. The date they met, their wedding anniversary, his birthday. She made a list of possibilities. Friday arrived. A masseuse, a sweet woman named Lynn, arrived at 10 in the morning. Amelia guided her to the spare bedroom far from the office. "I just need an hour or so," Amelia said. "Focus on my lower back, please." As Lynn's expert hands worked on her aching muscles, Amelia's mind was a whirlwind. This had to work. It was her only chance. After the massage, she felt genuinely relaxed, but her nerves were shot. She thanked Lynn, saw her out, and then the silence of the penthouse descended. It was go time. She locked the front door and drew the curtains, plunging the apartment into a dim twilight. She went straight to the office. The imposing mahogany door felt like the entrance to a dragon's lair. She stepped inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. Where would he hide it? She scanned the room, her eyes darting over every surface. The bookshelf, too obvious. The desk, too accessible. Her gaze fell upon a large framed abstract painting on the wall opposite the desk. It was a chaotic swirl of blacks and greys, a piece Julian had bought saying it represented the beautiful chaos of creation. It was the only piece of art in the room that wasn't hers. It hung slightly too far off the wall, she now noticed. With her breath held, she approached it. She ran her fingers along the heavy, ornate frame. Near the bottom, her fingers found a tiny, almost invisible indentation. She pressed it. There was a soft, pneumatic hiss, and the entire painting swung outward, like a door, revealing a flat, gunmetal grey panel set flush into the wall. The Aegis Pro. In the center was a small screen and a fingerprint scanner. Her stomach dropped. The fingerprint. How could she possibly get his fingerprint? She stared at the scanner, her mind racing. She couldn't force him. She couldn't trick him into placing his thumb here. Then her eyes landed on his desk, on his crystal glass of water from breakfast that morning, which the cleaners had been instructed not to touch until the evening. It was a long shot, a crazy movie plot idea, but it was the only one she had. Drawing on her long-forgotten art school skills, the patience for detail, the steady hand required for fine brushwork, she retrieved the glass. She took out a small container of the baby powder she had bought for the nursery and a makeup brush. Gently, she dusted the glass. Several faint whorled smudges appeared. His fingerprints. She selected the clearest one on the curve of the glass. Now for the hard part. Using a strip of high-quality packing tape she'd found, she carefully lifted the print. It was a delicate operation, her hands surprisingly steady. The faint, oily residue of his thumbprint transferred to the sticky surface of the tape. She carried the tape over to the safe as if it were a holy relic. This was insane. It wouldn't work. These things were designed to prevent exactly this. But she had to try. She carefully placed the tape over the scanner, pressing it flat. The scanner glowed red for a moment, then beeped angrily. Access denied. Her heart sank. Of course, it was too simple. She was about to give up when she remembered something she'd read on a security forum. Some older biometric models had a flaw. They could be fooled, but they needed a conductive layer. The human skin's natural electricity. The tape was an insulator. Frantic, she looked around. What could she use? Her eyes landed on a small bowl of paperclips on the desk. Metal. Conductive. With renewed hope, she tried again. She lifted another print from the glass. This time, before placing it on the scanner, she gently breathed on the tape, the moisture from her breath adding a microscopic layer of condensation. Then, holding the tape in place, she used the tip of a metal paperclip to complete the circuit, touching the edge of the tape and the metal casing of the scanner simultaneously. The scanner glowed blue. A soft click echoed in the silent room. The screen lit up, passcode required. Amelia gasped, a wave of dizziness washing over her. She had done it. The first lock was breached. Now, for the code. She looked at the keypad. Her list of dates ran through her mind. She started with their wedding anniversary. Invalid code. his birthday, invalid code, his company's incorporation date, invalid code. Her palms were sweating. What else could it be? What date was significant to him? She thought back to their whirlwind romance, trying to see it through his eyes, the eyes of a businessman executing a contract. What was the start date of the project the day they met? The day he walked into that small gallery and discovered her. Her fingers trembled as she typed in the date 10/6/23, June 10th, the day her old life had ended and this gilded lie had begun. There was another soft click. A green light flashed. Access granted. With a deep, shuddering breath, Amelia pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside were not jewels or cash, but neat stacks of folders and several hard drives. Her eyes scanned the labels, which were written in Julian's sharp, precise handwriting. Viridian Merger, Offshore Accounts, Project Air, Project Air. Her blood ran cold. With a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, she pulled out the folder. It was thick. She opened it. The first page was a cover sheet. Project Air, Marriage and Succession, Agreement Parties Julian Croft and Isabella Leanne. And there it was, in cold clinical legalese, a contract not between husband and wife, but between two corporate entities. It detailed the terms of their marriage, a union designed to satisfy a traditionalist clause in the Leanne family's company charter, which required a stable, family-oriented partner for the new joint CEO position. It stipulated that an heir, preferably male, must be produced within 3 years to secure the dynasty. And then the final soul-crushing section. Clause 11B, Dissolution and Compensation. It laid out the exact terms of her retirement. A one-time payment of $5 million transferred upon the signing of a non-disclosure agreement and the full relinquishment of all parental rights. There was even a copy of the relinquishment form waiting for her signature. Her name, Amelia Reyes, was typed neatly on the dotted line. But as she stared at the horrifying document, something else caught her eye. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the folder was another document with a different heading. Viridian Dynamics Project Chimera, Source Code Acquisition. It seemed unrelated, but her instincts screamed at her to look. She pulled it out. It was a technical brief filled with code and diagrams that were mostly gibberish to her. But she understood the summary on the front page. It detailed how Viridian's groundbreaking solar panel technology, the very foundation of Julian's empire, was not developed in-house. It was based on an algorithm allegedly stolen from a defunct university research project, a project led by a professor who had later died under mysterious circumstances. Amelia's blood turned to ice. This wasn't just a story of a broken heart. This was a story of profound criminal corruption. Julian hadn't just built his life with her on a lie. He had built his entire empire on one. She had found the contract that could destroy her life. And right next to it, she had found the one that could destroy his. Clutching the folders to her chest, she knew the game had changed. This was no longer just about escape. This was about justice. And she, the painfully simple artist, was now holding all the pieces. She took out her burner phone and began to photograph every single page, her face illuminated by the cold, merciless glow of the screen. The week after finding the documents was the most difficult of Amelia's life. Possessing the truth was one thing. Knowing how to wield it was another entirely. The evidence sat on her encrypted tablet, a ticking time bomb in her bedside drawer. Every time Julian smiled at her, every time he placed a hand on her stomach to feel their son kick, she felt a surge of revulsion, so powerful It almost choked her. She was a living, breathing lie, and the hypocrisy of it was eating her alive. She knew she couldn't do this alone. Julian was a titan surrounded by an army of lawyers who could bury her in litigation until her son was in college. She needed an ally, someone who was not just loyal, but brilliant. Someone from her old life. Her mind immediately went to David Chen. They had been friends in college, not close, but part of the same scrappy, ambitious circle. While she pursued art, he'd pursued law with a ferocious intensity. The last she'd heard, he'd become a rising star in corporate litigation at a small but tenacious boutique firm in the city known for taking on giants. He was sharp, relentless, and he had a strong moral compass, a rarity in the worlds he now moved in. Most importantly, he despised bullies. Finding him was a risk. Julian had eyes and ears everywhere. She couldn't just call him. She had to use the same caution and meticulous planning she'd used to crack the safe. She created a new anonymous email address at a public library computer 2 districts away. The message she sent was brief and cryptic. Subject: old friend, new project. Art-related. Hi, David. It's Amelia Reyes. We knew each other back at university. I know it's been a while. I have a very sensitive, high-value commission I need to discuss with a legal expert I can trust. It requires absolute discretion. Are you available for a consultation? Best, Amelia. She didn't mention Julian. She didn't mention marriage. She framed it as art, the one thing that still connected to her old identity. His reply came 2 days later. It was cautious, but intrigued. Amelia, good to hear from you. My door is always open for a consultation. Let me know when and where. David. She arranged to meet him at a noisy, crowded Fio restaurant in the Old Quarter, a place no one would ever expect to see the wife of Julian Croft. She dressed down, wearing an old hoodie and a baseball cap, and took a convoluted route using 2 different ride-sharing apps and a short walk to get there, ensuring she wasn't followed. When she saw David, her heart settled for the first time in weeks. He looked the same, just with a more expensive suit and a few more lines of concentration around his eyes. He stood up as she approached, his expression shifting from curiosity to shock as he took in her appearance and her very obvious pregnancy. Amelia, my God, he said, pulling out a chair for her. Congratulations are in order, I think. Thank you, David, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm afraid this isn't a social call. They ordered quickly, and then in low, urgent tones, she told him everything. She started with the fairy tale, the marriage, the penthouse. Then she told him about the overhearing, the phone call, the words incubator and contract. She saw the easy smile fade from his face, replaced by a look of grim focus. Finally, she slid the burner tablet across the table. It's all there, she whispered. The marriage contract, Project Air, and something else. Something I think is much worse. David spent the next 20 minutes in complete silence, his eyes scanning the documents she had photographed. He scrolled through page after page, his jaw tightening. When he got to the Project Chimera file, he stopped, letting out a low whistle. He read the summary twice, then looked up at her, his eyes blazing with a lawyer's righteous fire. Amelia, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Do you have any idea what this is? This isn't just grounds for a divorce. This is a corporate nuke. The marriage contract is monstrous. It's morally bankrupt, but it was drafted by clever lawyers. Fighting it would be messy, public, and traumatic. But this... He tapped the screen, showing the stolen algorithm report. This is racketeering. It's fraud on an epic scale. Viridian Dynamics isn't just a tech giant, it's a house of cards built on a stolen foundation. A sliver of hope, the first she'd felt in an eternity, pierced through her despair. "So what do I do?" "You, Amelia, are going to do nothing," David said, his voice firm. "You are going to go home and continue to be the perfect, unsuspecting wife. You are going to talk about baby names and complain about your swollen ankles. You are going to be so painfully simple that they won't see you coming until it's too late." "And you?" she asked. "I," he said, with a thin, predatory smile, "am going to architect their downfall. We're not going to sue for divorce. We're not going to leak this to the press. That's a shotgun blast. We need a sniper rifle. We are going to build a case so airtight and so devastating that Julian Croft won't have a choice but to give you everything you want, just to stop it from seeing the light of day." Over the next 2 weeks, David worked tirelessly in the shadows. He used Amelia's information as a starting point, hiring a private investigator, a former intelligence officer, to dig deeper into Project Chimera. They tracked down 2 former research assistants from the defunct university project. At first, they were terrified to talk, but David's firm offered them pro bono protection and the promise of anonymity. Their stories painted a sickening picture. The lead professor, Dr. Aris Thorne, had been on the verge of a breakthrough that would have revolutionized solar energy, making it incredibly cheap and efficient. He had refused to sell his research to corporations believing it belonged to the world. A few months later, Viridian Dynamics, then a small, struggling startup run by Julian Croft, suddenly announced they had developed a nearly identical technology. Dr. Thorne had threatened to sue to expose them. A week after that, he was killed in a random hit-and-run. The case was never solved. David now had sworn affidavits from the research assistants. He had the Project Chimera document. He had the marriage contract. He had everything he needed. "It's time," he told Amelia during another secret meeting, this time in a quiet corner of the National Library. "We're not going to serve him papers. We're not going to have a dramatic confrontation. We're going to arrange a meeting. You, me, him, and his partner in crime, Isabella Leanne." Isabella. Amelia's blood ran cold at the mention of her name. "Absolutely," David said. "She's a signatory on the marriage contract. She's the co-CEO of the new entity. She's just as culpable, and her presence will double our leverage. We'll present this as a final discussion about the dissolution agreement. They will walk in expecting to dictate terms to a broken, weeping woman. They are going to be very, very surprised." David's assistant sent the meeting request to Julian's and Isabella's offices. The subject was simple: A. Reyes. Terms of agreement. They accepted immediately, proposing the meeting take place in the Viridian Dynamics boardroom, the Lion's Den. "Perfect," David had said, with a grim smile. "Let them feel powerful. Let them feel in control right up to the very end." The day of the meeting, Amelia felt strangely calm. She chose her outfit with care. Not a power suit, but a simple, elegant maternity dress in a soft, cream color. She looked like what they expected her to be: a mother. Soft, gentle, and harmless. As she rode the elevator up to the top floor of the Viridian Tower with David, she placed a hand on her belly. The baby kicked strong and steady. It was as if he knew, as if he was telling her, "We can do this." When they walked into the boardroom, Julian and Isabella were already there, seated at one end of a long, polished obsidian table. The view of the city was even more spectacular than from the penthouse. Isabella was exactly as Amelia had imagined: sharp, impossibly chic. In a tailored suit, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon. She looked at Amelia with an expression of mild distaste and boredom, as if Amelia were a mess she was about to have cleaned up. Julian, on the other hand, adopted a look of pained sorrow, the concerned husband. "Amelia," he started, his voice dripping with false empathy. "I'm so sorry it has to be this way." Amelia didn't answer. She simply took her seat opposite them, David, placing a slim leather portfolio on the table in front of him. "Let's dispense with the theatrics, Julian," David said, his voice calm and clear. "We're here to discuss the terms of Amelia's exit. We've reviewed the Project Air agreement, and while we find it creative, my client feels the compensation offered is inadequate for her services." Isabella scoffed, a delicate, condescending sound. "Inadequate $5 million for 9 months of lying around seems more than generous for a woman of her background." Amelia met Isabella's cold gaze and held it, her silence more powerful than any retort. She would not let them bait her. "We're not here to negotiate the price of a child," David said coolly. He opened the portfolio. "We're here to discuss the price of your silence." He slid 2 documents across the table. The first was a copy of the marriage contract. Julian and Isabella barely glanced at it. The second was the cover sheet for Project Chimera. Julian's face went white. He stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. Isabella leaned forward, her brow furrowed in confusion, and read the title. "What is this?" she snapped, looking at Julian. "This," David said, "is the real foundation of Viridian dynamics, the story of a brilliant professor named Aris Thorne, and how his life's work, which he refused to sell miraculously, became your company's flagship technology just after his tragic and unsolved death." He then slid across the sworn affidavits from the research assistants, and these are the people who are willing to testify to that story under oath. The color drained from Isabella's face. The mask of bored superiority vanished, replaced by dawning horror and fury as she stared at Julian. She had merged her family's legitimate century-old company with a criminal enterprise. "You see," David continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "we're no longer discussing Amelia's quiet disappearance. We're discussing whether the two of you and the entire board of the newly formed Croft-Lian Corporation are going to be indicted for corporate espionage, fraud, and potentially accessories to a wrongful death investigation. We're discussing whether the name Viridian becomes synonymous with Enron." The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. Julian looked from the papers to David, to the cold fury in Isabella's eyes, and finally to Amelia. He was looking for the weeping, hysterical woman he thought he knew. He was looking for the sheet, simple artist he could manipulate. But the woman who met his gaze was a stranger. Her expression was serene. Her eyes were clear and steady, and in their depths he saw not heartbreak, but a steel conviction that terrified him. He had thought he was the director of the show, but he was just a character in hers, and she was about to write the final scene. The boardroom, once a symbol of Julian's absolute power, had become his tribunal. The panoramic view of the city seemed to mock him, a glittering empire on the verge of collapse. Isabella had pushed her chair back, putting a physical distance between herself and Julian, her face a mask of cold fury. She looked at him as if he were a contagion. Julian, for the first time since Amelia had known him, was utterly lost. His charismatic facade had shattered, revealing the cornered man beneath. He opened his mouth, but no words came. It was Amelia who finally broke the suffocating silence. Her quiet voice commanded the room. "This is what is going to happen," she said, looking directly at Julian. Her gaze was not that of a victim, but of an arbiter. David slid a single slim leather portfolio onto the obsidian table. "My client has prepared her own terms," he stated. "Consider it a counteroffer." Julian stared at the portfolio as Amelia began to speak, her voice gaining strength with every non-negotiable demand. "First," she began, "an irrevocable trust fund of $100 million will be established for my son. It will be managed by an independent trustee. He will want for nothing, but he will not be poisoned by the kind of wealth that corrupts." $100 million, Julian choked out. "That's insane." "Is it?" David interjected smoothly. "It seems a small price to avoid the implosion of a multi-billion-dollar corporation and decades in prison. Consider it a business expense." Amelia continued unflustered. "Second, the penthouse. It will be transferred into my name, free and clear. My son will be born in his own home. A home I will cleanse of your memory. Third," she said, her voice hardening, "you will relinquish all parental rights. You will have no contact with my son ever. You will not be on his birth certificate. To him, you will not exist. Your dynasty is built on lies. My son will have no part of it. He will be a Reyes, not a Croft." The words struck Julian like a physical blow. This was the one thing he hadn't anticipated, the complete erasure of his legacy. "Amelia, no. He's my son." "He is my son," she corrected him, her voice like ice. "He was never anything more than a commodity to you, a bargaining chip. That ends now." Isabella, who had been seething in silence, finally spoke, her voice venomous and aimed entirely at Julian. "Give her what she wants. This is the mess you created." She then turned her glacial gaze to Amelia. "This protects you. But what about my family's company? My reputation? You can still ruin us." "I know," Amelia said simply. This was the final crucial piece of her plan. "Which brings me to my final term, the Project Chimera evidence." David elaborated his tone, leaving no room for negotiation. "All evidence of Viridian's fraudulent origins will be placed in a secure vault. It will remain there untouched on one condition: you adhere to every term of this agreement for the rest of your lives. But the moment you breach this contract, if you stop a payment, if you try to contact Amelia or the child, the contents of that vault go directly to the Attorney General's office and the international press. Think of it as a permanent insurance policy. You will spend the rest of your lives looking over your shoulders." It was a brilliant, devastating checkmate. She wasn't just taking his money or his child. She was taking their freedom, shackling them to her silence forever. Julian slumped in his chair, defeated. Isabella, ever the pragmatist, saw this was the only way to salvage her family's name. "Draw up the papers," she said to David. She stood, her composure immaculate once more, and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving Julian alone in the ruins he had built. He sat there for a long moment, staring at Amelia, searching for a flicker of the woman he thought he'd married. He found none. "We had a good life, Amelia," he whispered, a pathetic last attempt at manipulation. Amelia stood, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She looked at him, not with hatred, but with a distant pity. "No, Julian, you had a good life. I had a job, and my contract is now terminated." With that, she turned and walked away, David following. Walking out of the Viridian Tower and into the bright sun felt like taking her first breath after drowning. She had walked in as a victim and walked out as a victor. She hadn't just escaped the gilded cage, she had dismantled it and used the bars to forge her own unbreakable freedom. Amelia's story didn't end with a dramatic courtroom showdown or a public shaming. It ended quietly, with the stroke of a pen on a series of documents that shifted power as definitively as any earthquake. She never saw Julian or Isabella again. True to his word, David ensured every term was met, every dollar transferred, every legal tie severed. The penthouse was scrubbed clean, not just of dust, but of the lingering presence of a life that was a lie. A few months later, she gave birth to a healthy, beautiful boy she named Michael, after the grandfather who had taught her what true unconditional love looked like. This wasn't a story about a woman who was broken by betrayal. It was about a woman who, in her most broken moment, discovered an unbreakable strength she never knew she possessed. It's a testament to the fact that the quietest people can have the strongest wills, and that the fierce, primal power of a mother's love for her child can move mountains and bring down empires. What did you think of Amelia's ultimate choice? Was justice served? We tell these stories to remind ourselves of the resilience of the human spirit. If Amelia's journey from a gilded cage to a life of true freedom moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner power. And of course, subscribe to our channel for more dramatic stories that will capture your heart and keep you on the edge of your seat. Thank you for listening.